Welcome, everyone, to this NOAA Science Seminar co-hosted by NOAA Ocean Exploration and the NOAA Library. In 2023, two teams within the National Park Service worked together to survey parts of the War in the Pacific National Historical Park on Guam. That project, which was funded by NOAA Ocean Exploration as part of a fiscal year 2022 opportunity, had two main goals. One was to identify submerged cultural material relating to World War II, and the other was to characterize cultural and natural changes to the landscape associated with the 1944 Battle of Guam. To share more about the team's methods and what they found, I'm excited to introduce the project's principal investigators who have agreed to join us today. Nunn is an underwater archaeologist whose work explores shipwrecks, submerged landscapes, and underwater battlefields. Anne has led and contributed to projects in more than a dozen countries and U.S. territories, including World War II aircraft recoveries, deep water investigations, and community science programs. Her past projects include battlefield mapping in the waters off Guam, excavating a World War II aircraft wreck in Palau, and leading a program that trained women veterans to help remove marine debris in national parks. Anna is passionate about inclusive fieldwork and using archaeology to connect the public with the past. A registered professional archaeologist, Anne holds a master's in maritime studies from East Carolina University. Also speaking today is Dr. Monique LaFrance Bartley, an oceanographer and coastal geomorphologist with the National Park Service's Water Resources Division. Monique supports resource management and stewardship within coastal, ocean, and Great Lakes parks through technical assistance, scientific research and communication, engagement with national projects, and collaboration with other federal agencies and partners. Her work focuses on coastal processes and hazards, seafloor mapping, and sea level rise. Before joining the National Park Service, Monique earned her MS and PhD from the University of Rhode Island Graduate School of Oceanography, where she also worked as a marine research specialist. Her research focused on shallow water habitat mapping and its value to resource management. Monique is passionate about multidisciplinary projects that holistically inform management and benefit the public. Anne and Monique, thank you so much for sharing your work with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brandon. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, good afternoon, all. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to the NOAA Library for hosting us. My name's Annie Nunn, and I'm an underwater archaeologist and was the PI for this project called Guam, a Biogeographic and Maritime Cultural Landscape Exploration of a World War II Amphibious Battlefield, alongside my co-PI, Dr. Monique LaFrance Bartley. I am going to go ahead and cut my camera so that I'm not blocking part of the screen, but we'll come back on to answer any questions that you may have later. All right. So this project was a collaborative effort between the federal agencies of the National Park Service and NOAA, specifically the Ocean Exploration Program. We had several science groups from the NPS participating, which included the Submerged Resources Center, Dr. LaFrance Bartley and her team from the Ocean and Coastal Resources Program and the Alaska region of the National Park Service, colleagues from the NOAA diving program, and most importantly, our partners at War in the Pacific National Historical Park in Guam, which is where this project took place. War in the Pacific, or WAPA, as it's shortened in the Park Service shorthand, is a national historical park, which was established to commemorate the bravery and sacrifice of those who participated in the Pacific theater campaigns of World War II, as well as to conserve and interpret the outstanding natural, scenic, and historic significance of the island of Guam. The park is broken up over 6 different park units that include both underwater and terrestrial-based sites of historical significance to World War II and Guam. And while there's so much of interest within the park, this project focused exclusively on the underwater and coastal elements, which are found at the Agate and Ascent Beach units of the park, which you can see outlined on this map. The idea for this exploration project began when we realized that no true comprehensive marine archaeological survey for cultural material had been completed in park waters of War in the Pacific. Some survey and documentation was completed in the 1980s by the National Park Service Submerged Cultural Resources Unit, which was the predecessor to the SRC, who identified the remains of some materials from the battle, including the Amtrak vehicle that you saw on the first slide off of Agate Beach, which was used to transport troops from naval ships to the beaches during the invasion. And the Submerged Cultural Resources Unit also completed some World War II cultural materials documentation in other areas of Guam outside of the park. But other than these documentation efforts, there hasn't been a systematic cultural resources survey completed, especially in the deep water areas of the park. So when the call for proposals for grants came around, I started scheming with Monique on how we could combine a battlefield archaeological survey with her specialty, which is oceanography and coastal systems. And we started thinking about how the war may have impacted not just the people and land of Guam, but how it impacted the ocean environment other than just leaving debris scattered across the seafloor. So we came up with the following three primary goals for the project. The first was to conduct the first comprehensive study to inventory submerged cultural resources relating to the 1944 invasion of Guam up to the 200-foot isobath in both coastal units of the park. The second was to document and analyze the battlescape, which included assessments of the geomorphology of the invasion beaches, documentation of features in the archaeological record, and an assessment of the military terrain called COA analysis, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. The third primary purpose focused on examining the resiliency of coastal and submerged natural features and habitats as it relates to human impact, such as World War II activities, but also natural processes. Similar to cultural resources, there had never been a study in coastal Guam that assesses the possible resulting long-lasting environmental impact on the island from World War II. So before we delve into the project itself, I want to back up just a little bit and tell you some about the history of World War II on the island. So prior to World War II, Guam was an American territory, and on December 8th, 1941, only 4 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded Guam. And if you know much about Pearl Harbor, you may know that the attack there occurred on December 7th, but the international dateline makes up the difference there. For 2 days, the Japanese bombed the island, focusing much of these efforts on U.S. military installations, including the Navy Yard, Upper Harbor, ships and barracks, as well as the radio station, and strafed civilian areas. And on the morning of December 10th, the 5,500-soldier Japanese South Seas Detachment landed on Guam's shores, where they first encountered and killed 13 Chamorro civilians. Left to defend the island at this time were 120 members of the Guam Insular Force Guard, who were Chamorro volunteers, 274 U.S. Navy personnel, almost half of whom were actually non-combatants, and 153 U.S. Marines. And between them, they had 3 machine guns and a few small arms and rifles to defend the main town of Agana. 21 members of the Guard and U.S. Navy were killed in a half-hour fight, as well as an unknown number of Japanese soldiers. U.S. Navy Captain George McMillan ultimately surrendered to prevent the massacre of his troops and the rest of the Guard. And the Imperial Japanese Army ruled Guam from December 1941 until July 1944. As the war continued and American forces crossed the Pacific, the Japanese army asserted that the Marianas Islands were Japan's final line of defense before the war reached Japanese shores and needed to be defended at all costs. And ultimately, over 18,000 Japanese troops were deployed to protect the island, where the army quickly built up military fortifications, forcing many Chamorro into slavery to build airstrips and other military installations, including gun emplacements and shoreline defenses, forced them to grow food, almost all of which was seized. And the Chamorro endured brutal beatings, intense propaganda, forced labor, sexual violence, massacres, and other atrocities during the war. When the United States Pacific Island hopping campaign finally reached Guam in July of 44, new specialized units called underwater demolition teams played a large part in the success of these amphibious invasions. These units were developed in World War II after several disastrous landings on Pacific islands where the fringing reefs prevented small boats from quickly and efficiently carrying soldiers all the way into the beach. At the island of Tarawa, for example, 1/3 of the initial landing force was wounded, missing, or dead due to the reefs blocking passage, and many men had to jump over the side of the landing craft in neck-deep or even deeper water to wade ashore with all of their gear, which, as you can imagine, was not a quick process. And if they weren't in deep water, they were extremely exposed on shallow reef flats. But the Marines learned from these hard-won experiences and established underwater demolition teams, which both demolished obstructions in the water, but also conducted reconnaissance missions, often at night and within sight of enemy soldiers, to identify and gather information on the best places for troops to come ashore. These underwater demolition teams were trained in distance swimming, breath hold freediving, and later pioneered the use of closed circuit rebreathers, as you can see in this picture here on the left, which we then went on to use as part of this project, rigging and detonating explosives, and hydrographic survey, among other things. And the first test of UDTs outside of training was at Normandy, which you can see here on the right, which wasn't a smashing success either in terms of obstacle removal, but it was a significant improvement upon the landings at Tarawa. UDTs in Guam were integral to removal of man-made obstacles placed on the beaches and in shallow water, which you can see here. These are wire barriers and rock scullies, which were essentially piles of coral rock wrapped in barbed wire and some additional coral rock barriers. And as you can see, these wouldn't do a whole lot to prevent someone from walking ashore, but it would prevent the easy landing of Amtraks and other amphibious vehicles. And so the UDTs were deployed prior to the marine landings. And in this picture here, you can actually see the detonation of some obstacles and the enormous explosion of water that it created. In Guam, an after-action report from UDT Team 3 states that the Japanese obstacles offshore of Asin Beach were in an almost continuous front along the reef. These obstacles were piles of coral rock inside a heavy wire frame made of heavy wire net, which you just saw. And this report also describes the method used to clear obstacles on the beach. So each platoon, which consisted of 15 men and 2 or 3 officers, left their ship in a landing craft while towing a couple of rubber boats behind them, which were loaded with packs of tetraidal, which is a highly explosive mixture of tetrol and TNT. The men would then take the small rubber boats and get as close to the obstacles as possible, where they would run a primacord trunk line along them, load them up with explosives, and when everything was set to go, they would give a firing signal and pull a 4-minute fuse and then get out. In Guam alone, the UDTs used upwards of 10,000 pounds of explosives to clear the landing beaches of obstacles and patches of the barrier reef that might prove cumbersome to the landing. So, imagine 10,000 pounds of explosives on a coral reef and the damage that can do. So I found all of this information out when I made a trip to the National Archives at College Park in Maryland to conduct research for the project, because there's really very little in terms of actual primary source historical documents about UDTs in Guam out there. So I pulled all of the boxes of records from work in the Pacific and found a folder on Guam, which is where some of the previous photos you saw came from as well. And I found this. This is an underwater archaeologist's wildest dreams. It is an X marks the spot map. So what you're looking at here is a hand-drawn map by a member of Underwater Demolition Team number 3 that he drew right after coming back on his transport ship after removing obstacles at Asin Beach. So all of these little X's in that light blue area of the drawing indicate the location of an obstacle that they detonated. So I had secretly hoped that something like this might exist, but I was, really trying not to get my hopes up, but I was amazed that it was out there. So we started to wonder if they used over 10,000 pounds of explosives on the reef, and we now know the exact location of where they placed those explosives, might we be able to still see the results of that damage today? And there was some really interesting work that was done by some colleagues at Peleliu as part of an OER grant led by Tony Carroll and Jen McKinnon that investigated this as well. And this question really informed a big part of our research. And Monique's going to talk more about what we found at these sites a little bit later in the presentation. So I'm going to stop here on that topic, and I'll pass it off to her to discuss the methodology for our project.
Thanks, Annie. So to accomplish our several project objectives, we collected a variety of data sets underwater and on land. During the first field campaign from January to February 2023, we collected underwater side-scan sonar, multi-beam bathymetry, magnetometry data, and photogrammetry data offshore of the Asin Beach and Agate Park units. These data were used to identify targets of interest that warranted further investigation by divers, which took place during the second field campaign between July and August 2023. In addition, on land, we collected coastal elevation data using LiDAR during the first field campaign and again during the second field campaign, so we had a time series data set. In the following slides, I'll briefly highlight these data sets. This slide shows the side-scan sonar data that were collected in February 2023. The team used an EdgeCheck 4125 and also a Klein 3000 to collect the data. Side-scan sonar, just a quick explanation, is an acoustic system that sends beams of sound to the seafloor. The sound energy hits the seafloor and is directed back towards the sonar. The sonar measures the intensity and angle of these return beams, as well as the total travel time, and uses this information to produce an image of the seafloor, which is similar to a black and white photograph. The resulting side-scan sonar mosaics are shown here, and you can see the top is from the Aspen Beach unit and the bottom is from the Agate unit. The survey area extends from the reef crest out to the 200-foot isobath for both units, and the data revealed features of the seafloor, their spatial complexity and heterogeneity, including the coral structure and sandy bed forms. And the data also revealed man-made objects such as material from World War II and debris that rest on the seafloor. The team also collected magnetometry data in tandem with the side-scan sonar data in February, using a Geometrics G882 cesium vapor magnetometer. This is a passive sonar used to identify magnetic anomalies, including those buried beneath the seafloor or on the seafloor. The resulting maps are not shown here to ensure the protection of the submerged resources within the park. Instead, I'm showing you an example data output that is presented on the Chesapeake Technology SonarWiz website. But you can see here that the gamma contours are overlaid onto the side scan, and you can use this information to identify magnetic anomalies and their intensity. We also collected multi-beam bathymetry data to complement the side scan sonar and magnetometry data. Similar to side scan, multi-beam is an acoustic system that sends beams of sound from the sonar to the seafloor. The sound energy hits the seafloor and is directed back towards the sonar. The sonar then measures the travel time of the beams and uses this information to calculate water depth. The resulting data is called bathymetry. From this process, we also get information about the seafloor's terrain, shape, and structure, which we call topography. Because of this, we're able to identify natural features as well as man-made objects in the bathymetry data. For this project, we collected bathymetry data using our EchoBoat 160 ASV. It's equipped with a Norbit multi-beam sonar system. This is a really great tool for us because we can program it to run missions on its own, as you see in the bottom right. We can also control it using a remote control, as you see in the middle image on the bottom, and we can tow it, which gives us the most control, especially in unknown environments, such as the area close to the reef crest. And that image is shown in the right bottom. This slide is showing some of the resulting bathymetry that we collected. The top image shows the bathymetry mosaic for the Aspen Beach unit extending from the reef crest offshore to the 200-foot isobath. The bottom image, you can see that we also map portions of the area inside of the reef crest. These efforts were limited due to the very shallow water depths. Similarly, here's the resulting bathymetry mosaic for the Agate unit. The image on the left shows the coverage extent from the reef crest out to the 200-foot isobath once again, and the image on the right shows a shallower area that's been mapped inside of the reef crest. Another form of remote sensing data we collected was photogrammetry. These surveys were done by the NPS Submerged Resources Center team using their custom-built CRA camera system, as well as the more common handheld underwater cameras in the shallower waters. Annie will provide more details about photogrammetry later in this presentation. I'll note that the CRA photo you see here is not from our project, but it's just demonstrates what the instrument looks like. The side-scan sonar and magnetometry data were the primary data sets that we used to identify the targets of interest to be further explored and documented by divers during the second field campaign, which again was in August of 2023. The dive team included divers from NOAA, the National Park Service, as well as volunteers from the Task Force Dagger Foundation and a volunteer from the Guam community. So we had a nice diverse audience of divers who had expanded skill sets and made for the successful survey. The divers conducted systematic underwater searches for the identified targets, followed by photo documentation, and these photographs just illustrate some of the work that was done. In addition to our underwater mapping efforts, we collected an extensive amount of coastal elevation data within the Aspen Beach and Agate Park units. Integrating the coastal elevation data with the submerged data was an important aspect of our project. It really allowed us to broaden our perspective and gain a more holistic understanding of the seascape and the landscape together. For this portion of the survey, we use a Trimble R12I and R10 GNSS receivers to collect point data sets, including of the erosional faces and their vegetation lines. And we also use an SX10 scanning total station to collect LiDAR data, resulting in high resolution, high density point cloud data throughout the park units. The images shown here are examples of the resulting point cloud data at the Agate unit. In the bottom right, you can see boulders, tree roots, and the erosional face along the sandy shore. And in the top left image, that's a zoomed out perspective of the same area. And here you can see the World War II Japanese pillbox in the background near the shoreline. And these point data can be used for quantitative analysis as well as qualitative analysis. So they're very powerful and can really visualize changes and features of interest. The image you see here is a compilation of 40 individual LiDAR scans from February 2023, as well as an additional 21 scans from July 2023. You can see here that the point cloud has been classified into categories, and this helps with analysis. For example, the yellow gold color represents the grass and the ground. The purple represents the park's roads and parking lots. Green is vegetation, and the teal and brown color along the coast are the beach margin and beach areas. This is a similar output for the Agate unit. Here we collected 39 scans in February and 13 in July. Again, this classified into the same categories for comparison, and these time series data allows us to assess for short-term change just within our project, and I'll discuss more about that later. And lastly, before I hand it back over to Annie, I just wanted to note that the LiDAR data can also be used to assess and monitor cultural features and park assets. So on the left here are images of the Japanese pillbox at the Agate Gone Point unit. You see the various perspectives and you can measure those distances and features and how they change over time. And then on the images on the right are the monuments that are within the Aspen Beach unit of the park. So with that, I'll pass it on to Annie to discuss some of our key findings.
Thanks, Monique. So as Monique mentioned, we used magnetometer and side scan sonar to help us identify many of the archaeological sites in park waters. Due to the large ferrous or iron containing content of many of the World War II associated artifacts that were located, these sites were primarily found with the magnetometer. However, the mag only tells us that there's something there, not exactly what is there. So we used diver investigations to confirm and document. We had several teams of divers working long days out on the water because we had over 400 possible site locations identified from the magnetometer survey alone. So all of these possible locations were loaded into a GPS, which the boat captain used to navigate precisely to each location. We would toss a marker buoy in the water and then send divers down the line to go investigate, armed with metal detectors and cameras. And here in this picture, you can see some project divers from the NOAA Dive Center completing a circle search on a site about 170 feet deep. So I'll walk you through some of the World War II related artifacts located during the project. This first one here may not look like much, but this is several sections of what is known as Marston mat or pierced steel planking, PSP, which was a widely used building material during World War II. Its intended use was for makeshift aircraft runways, but the utility of the material was recognized pretty quickly. It was employed for many uses during the war, including to stabilize Pacific beaches for moving supplies, which in fact you can see here off of Agate Beach in Guam in this historic photo that we came across in the Park Visitor Center. Soldiers here are using it to roll fuel barrels ashore and stabilize the sand to make that process easier. Another significant site recording is the unexploded ordnance dump off of Aspen Beach, known as the Camel Rock UXO dump. Camel Rock is a small rock island off the beach that drops off into very deep water very fast due to the underwater topography of the Pacific. Guam itself is actually the top of a submerged volcanic mountain, and the sides of the mountain drop off very steeply once you pass the reef crust surrounding the island. And at the end of the war, a large amount of unused munitions were purposefully dumped offshore here by the US military. So common practice after World War II that you dump it in the ocean, you never have to see it again, which we know now is definitely not the case. But the park and the public of Guam is aware of this site. Some of it is in shallow water right up against Camel Rock itself, and the park has documented much of it over the years. But the extent of the survey previously was up to 130 feet deep. Now, this dump area was one of our deepest dives of the project. We had a team all the way down at 200 feet on the surrounding slope. And in part due to the beautiful water visibility in Guam and the particularly good visibility on that specific day, we stopped descending at 200 feet, but you could see another 100 or so feet down the slope. And the UXO dump continues down the side of the submerged mountain pretty much as far as the eye could see. So it's fair to say that we now don't know exactly how deep and how far the UXO dump continues, but that it's much larger than previously known. And we were able to document that as part of this project. And it's really important to know the location of submerged UXO for good reason. This ammunition can still present an explosive hazard if tampered with, so it's important to know the extent of the site so that divers and boaters can be aware of what's in the area and exercise proper precautions. And the park plays a really big role in making sure that visitors to the park, know that this exists. World War II dumps across the Pacific are also currently being studied for environmental contamination concerns from chemicals leaking out of corroded munitions, which you can actually see the rust on the end of this round here. But it can harm marine life and the seabed around them, as well as possibly enter the human food chain as people still subsistence fish in this area. And there's a lot more to be done in this field of study, and is a challenge that many resource managers will face across the Pacific. And this here, I think you can see the mouse here, is a concreted crate of 50 caliber ammunition too. So lots of examples of these. These are just two images. So we were also able to relocate a World War II related site that hadn't been visited by archaeologists since the 80s, which is known as the American Pontoon Barge Site. While the site was first located by the predecessor office to the Submerged Resources Center in the 80s, a site location wasn't recorded. So we found it again with the magnetometer. The site contains a barge with a hoist or crane assembly, which was likely used for transferring fuel drums or other supplies to amphibious vehicles. There were also a lot of 55-gallon drums themselves, which you can see one on the left-hand side of this picture, a wheeled trailer, batteries still encased in their boxes, large pieces of sheet metal, a possible Amtrak door, crates of ammunition, all kinds of stuff. The report from the 80s also mentions a soldier's helmet on the site, but we were not able to relocate that. It's possible that it's now buried. It's also possible that it was taken off the site as a souvenir by someone who came across it at some point. But either way, illustrates why it's important to regularly visit, document, and inventory these historical sites. And this image here is a historic photograph I came across in the archives. And if you look here on the left-hand side, you can actually see a trailer that has gone astray. And this was actually very similar to the one that we found. There's no way to know if this is itself the exact one, but it does sort of illustrate, how something like this might happen. So I just thought that was pretty interesting. We also had several interesting shore finds located during a walking survey of the beaches, including this Japanese katagami-style pottery. This type of pottery was mass-produced in Japan from the 17th century to the early 20th century. And the blue design that you see was made using a paper stencil and cobalt pigment. And there wasn't really enough archaeological context on the beach here to determine if these pieces were brought to Guam by the Japanese in World War II, but it does certainly show the prevalence of Japanese influence on the island. There are also just mass amounts of metal debris on the reef flats at both park units. Much of it is unidentifiable to its original purpose because it's been salvaged, moved, etc. Over the years, but this type and amount of metal debris is pretty consistent with what you see in other areas of the Pacific where heavy fighting occurred during World War II. I would also be seriously remiss if I didn't mention the assistance of local divers in relocating some of the World War II related submerged sites in the park. In particular, we had the assistance of Mr. Louis Cabral, who grew up on Aspen Beach, still lives there today, and it was also home to his family in World War II. So we were able to hear some really interesting perspective on the impacts of the war from him. But there were also some sites known to him that are very fancy remote sensing equipment was not able to detect, partially due to the steep drop off nature of the reef wall, but also because there's really no replacement for local knowledge. And Lewis was able to show us the location of a few sites, including an amphibious vehicle known as an Amtrak, tucked under the reef wall, as well as these tracks here from another amphibious vehicle that are now embedded in a huge, beautiful coral head. And as you can see, the texture of the tracks is quite similar to the coral itself over here on the left, which is interesting, but also makes it really easy to miss in a visual dive survey. I'm going to go back to the Amtrak here, which is very interesting because there are two that were documented as part of the project, one at each coastal unit of the park. The one at Agate is a well-known dive site, but the one that Lewis showed us at Aspen Beach is known to some, but not highly visited because of its location in a pretty volatile area of the reef wall. It's also one of the only places in the park with poor visibility, and getting in and out with the tide can be tricky. So we really valued having his local knowledge to help us record it. This particular Amtrak is in relatively poor condition and broken apart as compared to the one that was on the title slide for our presentation, which may indicate that this one was lost to battle damage. So in the archival research we did that informed the project, there's a Marine Corps action report that reports that an Amtrak was hit by a mine as it left the particular area where this one is located, but there's no mention of how significant the damage was or if the Amtrak consequently sank where it was hit. So this is something that we have some ongoing research on. We recorded the site using photogrammetry. This is a screen capture of the model along with some analysis, which is a way of recording something in 3D using still photographs. So to record this, we take overlapping photographs. The number of photos you take depends on the size of the object you're trying to record. This particular site was recorded using about 400 or so photographs. I believe we then color correct them in Adobe Lightroom and use a software, a couple different softwares. One's called Agisoft Metashape. Another that we use is called 3D Zephyr to process the data into a 3D model. And then we can then use this model to do all kinds of things, including taking measurements, conducting archaeological analysis, sharing the sites around with our colleagues who may have experience on similar sites, and really, do that archaeological analysis from the comfort of our desktops rather than having to do some of these things underwater, which, we love to be underwater, but it often takes significantly more time and resources. We also used photogrammetry to record some features related to the removal of obstacles by the underwater demolition teams, which I mentioned earlier, but I'm going to pass that off to Monique to tell you about.
Thanks, Annie. Yes, the hand-drawn map that you see in the top right is the same one that Annie showed us earlier. This map, again, identifies the locations where the Japanese placed obstacles in an attempt to deter the U.S. troops from reaching the shore. Those obstacles were subsequently blown up by the U.S. UDTs. So Annie geo-rectified this map, and we were actually able to locate the line of blast craters in the field. So we were super excited about this. It was a big surprise to us to find that these craters are still present today, 80 years after World War II. This is especially true because the craters exist in a very shallow water environment and high energy environment. So my expectation was the craters would have been filled in by coral rubble and sand through natural coastal processes, storms, wave action over the past 8 decades. So some of the craters were found to contain fragments of metal embedded in the coral, which could be remnants of obstacles that were destroyed by the UDTs. So that was also an interesting notice. And clearly these craters are now an integral part of the seascape. It's also worth noting that we consider these blast craters cultural features. due to the lack of natural material caused by the UGT blast. And their presence really highlights the long-lasting World War II impacts to Guam's seascape. So again, really interesting and exciting and unexpected find for us. So of course, that being the case, we set out to document these craters every single way we could think of. The top left photo is a team marking the location of each crater with GNSS equipment, and the resulting map is what you saw on the previous slide. We also took photographs. The one you see in the top right was taken at low tide, so you can clearly see that depression visible. And we also created a really fantastic 3D photogrammetry model of one of the craters that's shown in the bottom middle here. We also documented the craters in the multi-beam data. From these data, we can conclude that the crater depressions are approximately 1/2 meter deep. You can see that they're quite visible. They're very obvious in the data. Again, like really exciting find for us. Pre-battle blasting activities also took place offshore of Agate. Annie showed this image earlier of blasting at Agate, and this was done to create a channel through the reef crest to allow the landing ship tanks to access the shoreline. Historic records indicated that the blasted area was 200 feet across and located directly offshore of Old Agate Village. Some reconnaissance surveys by Annie and her team, they were able to locate this blast channel, and they noticed it was filled with broken rubble and possibly war-related metal debris and UXO still. They took a lot of photographs, and they created this 3D photogrammetry model of the blast crater. And we also captured it, next slide please, in the bathymetry data that you can see here. So another, again, like documentation of long-lasting impacts from World War II in the area. I included this slide because it's just really fascinating. Here we've captured the sunken Amtrak that's located offshore of Agate. Annie, can you point to it? It's the green object in the blue. Yeah, right there. So it's nestled right on the sandy seafloor, adjacent to some coral structure. And it's just really beautiful imagery. And it shows how easily these objects can be hidden in plain sight, really. And next slide, please. And from a more natural resource perspective, the bathymetry data also give us a really fantastic view of the spur and groove coral structure that's present at the fringing reef. Really high resolution, and you can also make out individual coral heads. So just some fantastic data that we're able to collect for this project. In terms of the coastal elevation data, we had a really unique opportunity during our project thanks to Category 4 Typhoon Mawar that made landfall on Guam in May of 2023. So we had collected LiDAR in February and had planned to go out again in July. So the typhoon really had some perfect timing for us. And this allowed us to compare the data sets and document pre and post Mawar coastal change. You can see here from the scans on the screen, the typhoon redirected the mouth of the Asin River westward. You can also see there's a really well-formed delta that's created. All this sand that's been accumulated from being moved around and redeposited during the storm. This is another view of the Asin River mouth, just to really illustrate that point once again. The top left is the Asin River mouth in February. On the right is July, and the image below, that lighter sand color, is the February river mouth overlaid onto the July river mouth. So you can really see the substantial difference. On the next slide, another example of how the LiDAR data can be used. It captured some substantial erosion that occurred at Agate unit after the typhoon. The yellow color you see is classified as ground. So you can see in the February data set, there's quite a bit of yellow in that rectangular box, and that's now the blue color in July, which means that it's eroded and is now beachfront. And you can also see in this image, those red squares with the white arrow pointing to them, those are the gun emplacements that are within the park. So you can see how this erosion is going to start to impact the cultural resources that are within the park in the near future. So this information and this data has implications for resource management and protection. And another example, this slide is showing sea level rise projections from NOAA based on the report put out by Sweet and all in 2022. This is the ocean-facing World War II Japanese pillbox at Apaka Point within the Agate unit. The colored lines indicate projected sea level rise superimposed on our LiDAR data, and you can see, at what time intervals this cultural resource is anticipated to be impacted by sea level rise. So one thing that was really important to Annie and I in this project was to make sure our data was useful and can be applied to the park in the modern day, in addition to understanding World War II impacts and World War II history. So we purposely proposed a project that would focus on both natural and cultural resources. We recognized that the integration of these two resources, these categories that are often siloed and usually focused on independently, if we're merging them together, we'll have a better way to understand the long-lasting impacts of World War II and modern day, as well as document World War II artifacts that are still remaining on the seafloor. We recognize very clearly that the landscape and seascape of Guam have been transformed due to natural activities as well as human activities, such as World War II. But we also recognize it's hard to determine the direct impacts from World War II that are still lasting due to the continued impacts over time over the past 80 years. This project and the data from this project has already been incorporated into the park's recently completed unit management plan. So that's really been rewarding to see the data being used in real time and helping the park make sustainable decisions about the park. Again, the discovery of those blast craters within the reef flat of the Aspen Beach unit was a really valuable outcome of this project for Annie and I. We feel like this finding can really communicate the events of the war and would really resonate with people and garner appreciation and awareness of the history of the island. And those blast craters have relevance to cultural, historical, and ecological perspectives. Similarly, of course, the Amtrak's offshore of Aspen Beach and Agate provide us with opportunities for public engagement and outreach, as well as archaeological and scientific advancement, especially through monitoring and change over time. And as Annie mentioned, the UXO dump off of Aspen was also valuable to continue to document, especially as those materials continue to age on the seafloor. So overall, again, just to close this out, our intent with this exploration project was to inform resource stewardship, facilitate public engagement, and contribute to the story of World War II in the Pacific Theater. So I'll hand it back over to Annie for her concluding thoughts.
Thanks, Monique. So we have a lot of people to thank. I could probably spend an hour on that alone. But thank you to our NOAA Ocean Exploration colleagues, Phil and Adrian and others, the staff at War in the Pacific National Historical Park, most importantly for allowing and assisting us in completing this work, and all of the project staff from the National Park Service and NOAA, to our local volunteers, and thanks to all of you for attending this presentation as well. So I think we're going to open it up to some questions now. Brandon and Cassandra, I think I saw that there's one already in the chat. Is it okay if we just go ahead and start with that?
Yeah, sure. Let me get it on the screen for us all. All right, so Philip asks, the Echo boats appear to be successful micro ASVs in this application. Are there other UMS you considered using? And if there were, why the Echo boat?
I think that's a fairly easy question for us to answer. The Echo boat had recently been acquired by the Alaska region within the Park Service, and it's the only multi-beam sonar system that I know of within the Park Service. So it was kind of a one-choice, easy option, to be honest. But it served us really well. I was very happy with it. A couple hiccups, but I think that's usual in hydrographic surveys, but overall worked well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your response. And then no other questions have come in yet. We are on a bit of a delay, so we will give it a minute.
While we're waiting for any other questions to come in, when Monique was talking about the blast craters along the beach there in Assen, I will say one interesting thing that we learned was that some of the local community members actually use them to fish in, like stand in them as, kind of a depression and a viewpoint to see what else on the reef flat. So I thought that was a really interesting use of a World War II environmental feature that's still in use by the community. Just a little
Great,
fun
thank you.
tidbit.
No, love it.
Cassandra, I have a question for the presenters, if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I was interested in the fact that there are, I'm sure, a lot of other important maritime heritage sites around the Pacific. If we build off of the exploration involved in this project, can you speak to the importance of doing maritime heritage site inventories in other parts of the Pacific?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think really knowing what is in an area, be that a park, a marine sanctuary, anything that um, you know resource managers need to have a handle on and understand what it is that's in their care. It really helps inform the next steps of what do we do with it after that. So I think um, in the new world of long range AUVs and long term remote sensing data collection, it really offers a great opportunity to continue with our cultural resources inventory of everything across the Pacific. Anything else you want to add, Monique?
Nope, you did great.
Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And then our next question that we have, do you think the research team may identify similar findings on other near islands like Saipan?
Yeah, I'm going to let Monique answer this question because she actually got back from Saipan a few days ago and was out helping with some resource management out there. But there has been some really great work done in Saipan as well. I encourage you to look into the work of Dr. Jennifer McKinnon if you're interested in World War II artifacts in Saipan. But Monique, you want to talk about the park?
Yeah, I feel like, especially at the park, the same sorts of issues. It's American Memorial Park on Saipan, and I was just out there last week because a storm came through and caused some substantial erosion. So, and as that's happening, there's UXO being uncovered and other World War II artifacts being uncovered that the park has to think about how to deal with. So, the study that we conducted on Guam is very relatable to Saipan.
Awesome. Thank you for your response. And then our next question from Sid says they understand UDT created blast craters, but what about shore bombardment craters from US Navy ships up to 16-inch rounds, too?
Yeah, there's definitely evidence of those on the terrestrial landscape. I would say more than on the area that we focused on, which was just the beach and in the water itself. That's not to say that land or that rounds didn't land on those reef flats, because I'm sure that they did. However, I can't think of any instances of anything that we saw that I felt like would have been bigger than what the UDTs created in on the reef flats. However, it is very evident in other areas of the park as well. But yeah, really interesting question. There was a lot more than just the underwater demolition team explosions for sure. There's some really great historic photographs. Not to plug our report, but it is going to be available for the public, and there's some interesting photographs, kind of juxtapose of historic and modern, where you can really see the difference in the topography.
Yeah, and the vegetation has really grown back over time. So during the war, it was pretty much bare earth, but now it's some of those, I'm sure, blast craters and impacts are going to be harder to find due to the vegetation.
Great, thank you. Our next question, very exciting work. Of the cultural resources you documented in this project, are there any that are so vulnerable to SLR or other climate impacts that have been identified as a priority to document or excavate or otherwise protect?
I
That's a really good question. Yeah, I'm kind of pausing to think. The coastal features that are currently subject to sea level rise, I believe, have been pretty well documented both by this project and previously. But I mean, I think this question kind of ties into what Monique was just talking about in Saipan as well, right? There are still new resources that are being, uncovered literally, even now that we didn't know existed due to coastal erosion and another human impact. Monique, do you want to talk a little bit about, how that bunker was exposed? I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. On Saipan, in the last storm, there was a old Japanese ammunitions bunker that was exposed, and within what were several thousand rounds of ammunition that were taken out, extracted by the U.S. Navy. So unknown it was there. It was right on shore for, quite a while, and storm came through, passed by, exposed it. And so I feel like Annie said, there's just resources being uncovered all the time. And then even the resources, like I'm thinking of the pillboxes. There's some pillboxes off on Guam that are now, submerged or partially submerged because the land has eroded away. I don't believe there's any intent to excavate these resources. I think the goal at this point is just to document them and leave them in place, especially in such a dynamic area, has the coast. It would be hard to try to save and protect the coastline without substantial coastal engineering solution.
Awesome. Thank you for covering that. That is all the questions in the queue. Okay, and nothing has come in with that. So awesome. Thank you both so much for joining us today and for sharing your work with us. This was really great and fascinating to hear about. And thank you, Brandon, for helping out with today's presentation. Brandon, do you have any last comments?
Well, thank you so much to Cassandra for facilitating, and thank you again to Anne and Monique for an excellent presentation. Before we wrap up, I just wanted to let everyone know that our next seminar, co-hosted by NOAA Ocean Exploration and the NOAA Library, is scheduled for October 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That one will feature Professor Larry Meyer from the University of New Hampshire talking about his work with an autonomous sail drone surface vessel. More information about that seminar will be released in the coming weeks, so I hope you'll look forward to it. Otherwise, have a great day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.